Well, I have been waiting to talk about this, but I did want to publish videos on other things about the IWW so I could get used to thinking about it and talking about it. But I think it is finally time for me to talk about my experiences with the IWW. So, what did my IWW branch actually do while I was in it? Well, one part of what they did was prison activists. They had the IWOC, the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, and they would send emails back and forth with inmates at local prisons. And sometimes, when the conditions of the prisoners were bad, they would organize a phone zap where they repeatedly call the prison, get a lot of different people to repeatedly call the prison to demand better conditions. So they had some prison activism, which I took a bit of an interest in, but I never ended up participating in, as well as trying to create unions in various places. For example, there were people who were dual carders who had a membership in the teachers union as well as the IWW. But the teachers union, unfortunately, due to the laws about union workers who are employed by the states, particularly teachers, they don't have collective bargaining rights. A lot of what they do is illegal. It's very easy for them to get fired. So, they were more or less powerless. And there were a few different budding workplace organizing efforts that fluctuated up and down. But for the most part, it was pretty out of touch, really. Like, for example, when a local coffee shop chain was being organized by the major union, the IBEW, the IWW had already had an ongoing effort in that company. They didn't even know that the IBEW was organizing this workplace, this employer. And, so they just kind of had like one or two people who worked there who had an interest in organizing it, but weren't really actively doing it. The one really strong, seemingly strong, the strongest, most active union was the CapTel Workers Union, and that is the union that I was a part of. Now, what is CapTel? Well, I can't describe exactly what they do for legal reasons, but we were sort of a captionist call center. And so we would all be, in our cubicles for the most part, trying to create captions for people's phone conversations who are hard of hearing. So when I first joined the IWW, it was because the main leader of the union, who I will call Sabo, because I'm not sure if he wants to be named, but I'll call him Sabo. He was an anarcho-communist Christian. He was a fairly effective organizer. He was a charming guy. He knew how to talk to people, and having done evangelism for his church, going door to door, etc., he was able to rally about a dozen workers to the cause of making the CapTel union. Now, there were hundreds of workers at CapTel, so this little effort, it wasn't really that significant. It wasn't that much. And throughout the whole duration of the existence of the union, to my knowledge, to my memory, it never really exceeded probably 6 to 12 people that were actively interested in it, that wanted to attend our meetings, etc. So I found out about this union because he handed me a pamphlet, and it was describing the exploitation of CapTel workers. It was demanding that we get paid $15 an hour. It was demanding other things as well, which we never got. But, having felt very powerless in my previous job, I was immediately interested in this union. I joined the IWW. He gave me the IWW bylaws, and he gave me the One Big Union pamphlet. And, so I was very interested in this. I joined the IWW, and I read the One Big Union pamphlet describing this desire to create, one big union, as it says, to sort of tell the state what to do. And this fantasy began to build in my mind. I was thinking, we can build a world where workers, where the great masses of people finally take what's ours, and we finally, get what we need. We finally get healthcare. We can finally end the wars because we're going to be the government. We need to create a people's government. And I saw the one big union. I saw, trade unionism as a potential vehicle to do this. I started thinking sort of like Daniel De Leon, who wanted to replace the, U.S. Institutions of government like the House and Senate with a coalition of labor unions, right? So I started to imagine a better world. And I started to think, if I engage in this struggle now, sure, it may be small, but, aren't we working towards something bigger? Isn't this going to grow into something much greater? Now, of course, at the time, I didn't have the awareness that I have now, not just from the practice of the union, which taught me, truth from fiction, but also from learning the history of trade unionism in general in America and realizing, the place where we are actually at. So the IWW only had really one single unifying demand. Other than the One Big Union pamphlet, they demanded the abolition of wage labor. So the IWW demanded, I'm not sure exactly what's implied by this, because the Soviet Union abolished wage labor and replaced it with salaried labor, meaning that, you're still getting paid more or less for your work. If you don't work, you still can't eat. But in the case of, the Soviet Union, did they abolish wage labor by the IWW definition? Not really sure. They never specified. But the abolition of wage labor was very appealing to me because I imagined a world where instead of having to go to work, I could simply decide, when I want to work, or how much I want to work without having to worry about anything like losing health care or, not being able to afford rent and food and other basic things. So, I started to imagine this better world. I became a fervent reader of both anarchist and Marxist literature, especially while on work shifts, something which I was often caught for by staff, but luckily it never became severe enough to get me fired. I also attended 16 hours of organizer training, or they were called OT classes, OT 101 and 102, in person, which were meant to tell us how to create these unions. And despite the fact that the two people that, were teaching these classes, they had worked in unions, but they had never successfully created a union. They had never, for example, gone through the NLRB contract process in creating a union, right? So, very few people actually have successfully organized unions with the IWW, but they're still very keen to tell you how to do it, which means, a lot of their advice is pretty questionable. But, at least they're trying, at least it's getting started something. And I thought, if I organize this union, if I go through these processes, then I'm going to learn more and I'm going to be able to teach people how to make unions. This whole thing, it's going to grow, it's going to spread, and we really will build the one big union. And that's what I genuinely believed. I knew our only examples of success were the fact that we had organized some, burger joints and donut shops and coffee shops in towns like Portland. I understood that, but I thought, if they can do that, why can't we scale it up? Why can't we keep going? This workplace of a few hundred people, why can't we organize it? Right? Well, I learned the truth through my experience. Now, there was actually, interestingly enough, during the time I was working in this union, there was a place that is near where I live that unionized, non-IWW union, but, the workers created a union and the owners of the cafe simply shut it down, and the IWW went there to help the workers picket for severance pay, which they never got. So, I started to become aware of just how easy it is for employers to shut down unions. I learned that the, burger union, for example, that was created had actually fallen apart. And, it was still being used as an example, despite the fact that it no longer existed. So, I did start to have some doubts, but I thought, what, I'm smart. I can figure this out. And if I'm doing this, I'm devoting myself to, the working class, to the common man. And that's something I always wanted to do. So, when I first joined this union, the CapTel Workers Union, our meetings looked kind of like this. We would sit down, maybe at some library in person, and we would complain about the bosses, maybe work on some, pamphlets. We created pamphlets, and then we would kind of speculate on new strategies or, plan what we're going to do next. Well, what did these strategies actually entail? Well, the OT classes were intended to tell us what we can do. Some examples are the March on the Boss. We had union members go into the boss's office to deliver the demands of the union and, demand better conditions, right? Another thing we did was we put CapTel Workers Union stickers on books and put them on the company bookshelf. Now, of course, the company took these books off of the shelf and checked them for stickers, and if they had a sticker, they would simply throw them away. They didn't have time for our crap, but we still did it, right? Another thing we did was sick outs, right? So we told the bosses at the company, hey, because you didn't give us higher pay and better conditions, we got a mass of workers to call in sick in order to try to put strain on the company. I'm not sure if this actually did anything, but we did also organize a sick out. And there's other types of actions that you can do, but a lot of them are not applicable to a call center. And a big problem with what we were doing is that we would only get a few dozen people at most on board with our actions, when really we needed 100 or 200 people to get on board with what we're doing, which we just simply couldn't do, And when it gets to this point, we also organized pickets. Well, the pickets were mostly people from the IWW that were picketing, trying to fill in for the fact that there were only a few CapTel workers who actually wanted to go picket in front of CapTel. People didn't want to lose their jobs. People, they weren't fed up enough. They weren't at the point of wanting to picket. While our union was at the point of saying like, hey, we marched on the boss, we did our sick out, they know that workers are upset. Now it's time to picket. Well, that was, leftism. We were disconnected from the actual workers who were, where they were at. They were not fed up with CapTel. They were more or less content with it. And I distinctly remember, for example, talking to a woman who was not getting paid enough and didn't have good enough benefits, and she was in medical debt that was weighing her down and making it hard for her to live a good life. But when I talked to her to try to get her to, be more agitated and want to actually do things for the union, she didn't have a desire to do it because she didn't want to lose her job. She didn't want to lose what little she had left. She didn't want to get in trouble, right? So, we thought eventually, maybe we would try to organize a strike if we continued to picket and continued to do these actions. We thought direct action gets the goods, and eventually people will follow our example and they won't be afraid. I wasn't afraid. I picketed. I did all of these things, and I was never fired from CapTel. And I understand that, we have a right to organize. This is part of the law, is that we are allowed to organize, workers. We are allowed to create a union. I understand companies will trample on that and fire people, and there's pretty much nothing you can do. But, I understood this, and I was fearless, and I wasn't afraid of losing my job. But, a lot of people were, especially the ones in the more dire straits. Now, I participated in some of these activities. I picketed, I bought used books from a library and stickered them and put them on the shelves. One of the most notable things that I did actually was me and a few others workers, we baked cookies that said $15 on them. And for Valentine's Day, we baked these heart-shaped cookies that say $15 on them. Now, what's funny is people thought that we were fundraising for the union and that the cookies cost $15. No, the cookies are free. We are trying to ask for $15 an hour, right? But, I sat there on my lunch break with these cookies, and, it was like I had someone from HR come and say, hey, you can't do this. And I'm like, I have a right to organize. This is organizing workers here, and I have a right to do it. And she backed off. She didn't know how to handle that. And, I wasn't fired for doing it, despite the fact that management knew exactly what I was doing. But what they did do was, after my lunch break is over and I leave these cookies out, they confiscated the mat that the cookies were underneath. We had these mats underneath them that had Helen Keller on them with some quote about labor or something. And they actually took these mats out from under the cookies and threw them away. So we simply just had a bunch of cookies sitting directly on a table that's, probably not clean, that nobody wants to eat off of. I only got one name from doing the action, so who knows how much awareness that I really raised. People probably thought that I was pretty silly, but I did this action, and I'm proud of it, even though it's very silly, maybe even stupid. I'm proud that I did that, and that I stood up for what I believed in, even though I don't think it led to anything greater. Now, eventually, Sabo, the guy who brought me into this union, he ended up leaving to attend college. So I became the de facto leader of the union. I had begun to form closer ties with the leadership of the IWW branch, as well as the national IWW leadership. I was serving as what's called the ODL, where I would report on branch membership, branch activities, and bring information back from the national part of the IWW. And so, naturally, I was going to also lead this union because I was starting to learn how to be a leader and this kind of thing, right? So, I made our unions a lot more formal, right? So instead of sitting down and then complaining and then maybe speculating, I had an agenda. And people come into the meeting and we go over the agenda and it's done, right? So no venting, none of this disorganized stuff. And I actually would check in on people who are trying to do things like, hey, did you do this or not? The problem is we didn't actually do very much. After Sabo left, we pretty much, I was just a bureaucrat. I didn't have the fire to organize. I didn't feel like it was working. I was really starting to lose hope. So I just became this sort of bureaucrat, and I wasn't stifling people. I don't think, I hope I wasn't, but I just think that, Sabo, he had this energy and desire to organize and move people, and this faith that he could change things. And that was a faith that I was starting to lose, And, we maintained contact lists of workers. We had lists, of who works here, do we have their number? Do they like us? Have we called them? And, I would text or call people to try to get them to join the union. And I never really knew what to say. What am I supposed to tell them, right? I remember calling somebody and I was like, yeah, we're trying to get $15 an hour. And they're like, well, who are you working for? And I'm like, the IWW. And they're like, we have not, I've never heard of that, and is that part of the fight for 15 movement? What are you talking about? And I'm like, well, we're just trying to organize a workers union that, They simply didn't get it. They simply didn't know. I didn't know what to say to them, and they ended up hanging up on me because, I had a lot of trouble explaining, what the IWW actually believes and what the purpose of the IWW is, just because it sounds so far-fetched and crazy to somebody who hasn't had their mind deep thinking about what are we supposed to do, right? Who doesn't have an open, mind to the fantasy that the IWW was promoting. And I remember when I first joined the IWW, I was very naive, bright-eyed, open-minded, kind of anarchistic and liberal, and I just wanted to rise up and fight for what I believed in. I didn't really know if what I was doing was going to have an effect. And, I was also, at the same time, I was kind of hard-headed in my own way. I would say I was not particularly nice to work with. And, I learned from my failures in that case. I know that I could have done better, than I did. I know that I could have organized better. I could have read more on how to organize, and, maybe I could have done more actions. But, I think that ultimately the reason why I didn't do more is because I realized that it was exactly that. I was living in a fantasy. The only time when this union seemed to make any sense to me, when I had any motivation to work on it, was when I was smoking, pot, which I don't do anymore. But, that was the only time it made any sense to me. So, I think you could maybe understand why a lot of leftists think and act the way they do if you understand that they are living in a sort of psychedelic, pot fantasy, and they're not really here, they're not really present because, they have escaped into their head using drugs, on the regular. Now, about a year into the IWW, I joined the PSL. I'd been reading anarchists, and I could never make any sense out of anarchist theory. It never made a single bit of goddamn sense to me. And, it's like, I read Kropotkin, what's the hype around this guy? I mean, he's a good writer, and I think the first chapter of The Conquest of Bread is very well written, and I like most of it, but like how is this going to translate into something real? I understand, okay, workers deserve the earth, but that he starts talking about coal miners and greenhouses and all these things, steam engines. And, he's talking about all these things that have zero relevance or meaning to me. They have it doesn't translate into something real. And Lenin made sense to me. I read Lenin. That actually made sense to me. I understood Lenin. I did not understand anarchism. I did not understand the relevance of it, anarcho-communism, any of this, right? So for a while, I was a member of both the IWW and PSL, which is a little bit odd, but neither of them, since the IWW is technically just a union, and not a political party, there was no contradiction of interest between PSL and IWW, but nobody in either org particularly wanted to work with people in the other org. This very silly sectarianism. I think that if the IWW people were to be in contact with the PSL people and sharing their information and knowledge, they would be able to refine what exactly it is they're doing and trying to achieve and reconcile some of their contradictions. The IWW said, we are in the protest cage. The PSL is in the protest cage. I'm no longer part of PSL, but, the IWW is saying PSL is in the protest cage, and the PSL was saying, I don't know what they were saying about IWW. PSL is very sectarian and inward-facing group. It doesn't, seem to have this sort of stance or orientation or networking ability outside of, connecting to a few select groups that share its exact way of thinking, but are usually more like liberal. So, I was pretty busy, both as an IWW union leader and ODL, as well as being part of PSL and having to fulfill membership duties, right? IWW has no membership duties, but PSL does. So, I was pretty busy. I was pretty stacked with all of this activism, but, eventually I just realized that this union effort was not going anywhere. I organized our meetings with the agenda every month, and it felt the same every single month. Nothing was getting done. I was just this sort of bureaucrat, unable to grow the union. And I wasn't even getting paid to do it, right? I felt like I was just a monk tolling the bell, as Mao would say, is a type of liberalism, right? You're just doing your job. You don't have your eyes on the prize. You're not trying to grow and succeed. That's because there's no prize for me to eye. I no longer believed in the same fantasy that I believed in when I joined the IWW. So I stopped organizing the CapTel union. I tried to hand over the reins as best I could, but, that CapTel union was effectively dead when I left. And, that's it. In 2020, no more CapTel union. And then about 2 years later, CapTel, most of the jobs actually disappeared. I lost my job at CapTel to automation. Now, I think this is an important lesson because I think the workers at CapTel understood inherently that their job could be automated away, and so they didn't respect themselves as workers and want to organize for a more permanent position. And what are you supposed to do when you're getting automated? I mean, if you organize a strike against automation, all the striking workers will be the first ones to be laid off. So there's really no way that you can prevent this automation from taking over. There's only so much you can do. And in typical IWW fashion, the CapTel Workers Union website is still up, even though there's hardly any workers at CapTel. These rounds of layoffs are actually still happening, one after another. But the IWW, part of its job is to, keep up this facade that it's still working, that its unions are still alive, so that it can justify taking all of this money from, people who believe in it, right? It has to have this story. So I think that the CapTel Workers Union, is going to be considered a success story. They're going to somehow twist it into a success story and an advertisement for the IWW, which I simply, in good faith, cannot do. I cannot do that. Now, this was a good first experience for sure. And, I really think that anybody who really believes in what they believe, they should try to put it into practice. I'm tired of this pure war of ideas, this pure war of utopias, of, theoretical, we could do this, we should do this, without anybody actually trying to build something. It's very stupid. This isn't going to reach the masses. Where are the masses? Okay, you're telling me it's not going to reach the masses, right? Where are the people? They're not hearing you. You're not visible. How do you know how they're going to respond unless you've actually told them? I had random workers from my workplace on the phone, and I had to talk to them and learn from them. I didn't get to just sit cozy and dictate what I thought was best and, what I thought wasn't going to work. No, I actually had to go and deal with, the people and deal with reality. And this is something that's incredibly important for people to do. People that don't do it, they just don't know, they don't understand, what the average person is like. They have to rely on stereotypes or personal experiences, or you absolutely do have to go to the people and do what you believe in. And if you don't, you will never learn better. You will never make any progress. You're just going to war over ideas and factions and drama and, have this sort of war of utopias and coulds and woulds and shoulds without ever actually doing anything. And, the IWW people, this is their problem, is that they want strong unions, but they refuse to try to actually build them. Or if they do try to build them, they frame it as something that it's not. They refuse to learn the lesson from their own failure and inability to do what they're trying to do. And I understand the objective conditions may change. Labor is going to be more and more at a disadvantage as the global Western financial system breaks down. I understand that the position of labor it's not going to be where it was. And, the need for unions is actually, springing back to some extent. The IWW is not responsible for this spring back in unionism. But, it's because the objective conditions have changed. And, maybe it will be possible to create more militant unions. But if you don't try and learn your lesson, then all you're doing is arguing ideas. And so many people that I run into and talk to, they've never done anything, and they think they know more than me about what I've already tried to do. So many of these leftists, they fetishize their ideas, they don't put them into practice, they live in a fantasy world, and they simply will never learn why they are wrong. They will simply never learn why they will never reach the masses, because they've never talked to random people. They don't understand. So this is the number one mistake in politics, is to fight only this battle of words. And my experience in the IWW, a few years ago, taught me better than that. And it's because I went and actually tried to do what I believe in and tried to build what I believe in. And, that's something that a lot of people can't say. So, I think that, look, if you are not convinced by this video, that the IWW is going to fail, which I really do believe it will fail. I don't think it's going to succeed. And the other 3 videos in this series will explain that in greater detail. But, if you're not yet convinced of that, then I say go join the IWW and do exactly what you believe in. Get off of your ass. Don't complain at me. Don't tell me I'm wrong. Go do it. And with that, I am done talking about the IWW. So thank you very much. This has been Hertz from Bismuth. Remember to like the video if you like it, dislike if you don't like it. Comment if you have something to add, maybe I missed something. Subscribe for more, and share this video around so that other people can get the message. See you next time.